Welcome, council, to our Tuesday, July 13th work session. This is 6 p.m. and we're all here, and we're glad we're all okay, and that Bountiful is not on fire. Even though we had a little grass fire, we maybe heard that, but they fixed it. So that's good today. We appreciate all of you who are out there. Those of you who have come to be involved here with our work session, you're very welcome to be here. If there are no pressing matters from the council right this moment, I'm going to turn the time over to Gary.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. We have a little bit of a presentation. We'd like during the work session to spend maybe 50 minutes on the first topic, which is affordable housing legislation and related impacts. And then the last 10 minutes on the day of service, if that's okay.
Perfect.
So I think you're all aware that since the last legislative session, there have been a number of committees and legislators and interested parties who've been meeting to discuss affordable housing. We've all been aware and talked about for years about the coming population growth that we're going to see along the Wasatch Front. And in the last couple of years, terms like housing affordability versus affordable housing have popped up. And we've heard terms like the affordability gap or the housing gap, which refers to a shortage in the number of homes for purchase. That's been something that's been on our minds and our vocabulary for at least 5 or 6 years, sort of at a high level. But of course, the last year we've seen just a dramatic increase in the actual cost of homes, and that has made a lot of people really concerned. And legislators' leadership has created a commission and tasked them with finding some solutions to it. Of concern is I was at a League of Cities and Towns board meeting where the two chairs of that committee came, and they told us that the leadership in both the House and Senate told them that this is the year to fix the city problem. Now, by the city problem, they're referring to things such as zoning, density, fees, impact fees, all of those things that members of the development community have said for years, even before terms like housing affordability and housing gap came up, that were impacting the costs of homes and development and were in the way of essentially their business model. I'm going to use terms like the PRC. The PRC is the Property Rights Coalition. It's a group of, it's a lobby interest, essentially. It's a coalition of organizations that are in the development community. It includes home builders like Ivory Homes or trying to think of some of the other organizations that are in there. Kate would know off the top of her head, but yeah, Brighton Homes, Ivory Homes, you've got it's not just home builders either. It's developers and things like that.
Let me just ask a question, Kate. So how many lobbyists would they have in that organization, Kate? Do you know, approximately?
They have several. The Property Rights Coalition has a lobbyist primarily for the coalition, Mike Ostermiller, but they also have each of those development interests will sometimes retain their own. So you end up with a handful. The Home Builders Association has their own lobbyists. The realtors have their own lobbyists. So you end up with a significant number.
So they may have 8 or 10 or more. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Gary.
It's great. No, it's fine. A number of years ago, the League of Cities and Towns created an effort to sit down in between sessions every year and work with the Home Builders Association, the PRC essentially. They call this the Land Use Task Force. It's made up of city and county representatives and other interests and the PRC to try and come to consensus on things that we could work on together. Over the last few years, that relationship has worked less and less well with things that we seem to have agreement on, and then we would suddenly see a bill that was against what the consensus was by the development group, by some development interest. I'm just going to speak frankly, and it may get me a little bit into trouble, but I hope not. But I think it's important to point out that there's a very large development interest at the legislature, and that includes the Speaker of the House, who's a home builder, and the President of the Senate, who's a developer. And regardless if they're both Davis County representatives, they represent a large portion of the interest of our elected officials. And so there's a very sympathetic ear, and it's really a worldview that they see legislation through. And for years, this worldview has been that local government is an obstacle to home building, both profitability and numbers of homes. It just seems like the affordable housing crisis has become an opportunity to put into effect legislation that they've wanted for many years under the guise of affordable housing. So earlier this year, the chairs of the Commission on Housing Affordability asked both the Property Rights Coalition and the League of Cities and Towns to give their, what were referred to as their wish lists. If they could have anything they want, what would they like to see change in state law? And those lists, because I believe their intention is to set up sort of some horse trading. Okay, the cities get this, and the development community gets this, and nobody's happy, but that means it's good legislation, and we'll all go home happy until the next legislative session, when our compromise gets ignored, and they take the next step of the other things that they want to see. Again, I'm wearing my cynical hat a little bit, but I've seen this enough that I know how this works. The things that were recommended by the Commission on Housing the Property Rights Coalition were things like this: a mandatory upzoning of all single-family lots in the state to multifamily, removal of ability of cities to designate their own zoning. This is a wonderful one: the ability of a commercial property owner to, without city council, without a public hearing, without city council approval, to just convert their property to multifamily housing. So imagine 5 Points that is a large 7-acre, 8-acre parcel, and that developer just says, well, I think I'm just going to put apartments everywhere. I'm not going to worry about transit. I'm not going to worry about the commercial component, all these things that we've been working on for many years. They have the ability to just do that. Doing away with impact fees, putting caps on the fees that we can charge to recover our costs for inspections, not allowing cities to do inspections, allowing the developers, and this was actually in legislation last year, allowing the development community to buy their own independent building inspector in the name of having things move more quickly. It's a vast list of wishes. My hope tonight and my concern with this is that I think there are some fundamental questions that we need to ask of our legislators, all of them statewide, that are some of the underlying principles that should be talked about before we get into trading this wish list item for this wish list item. And so tonight I kind of want to talk about some of those, if that's okay. I gave the background. This was the slide for the background. Hope you enjoyed that, everyone. Okay, issue 1, that's not really being discussed, which is who should pay the cost of new infrastructure, new development or existing residents? Council, how many of you have built a home? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Pretty much.
Essentially. When you built that home, do you remember some of the infrastructure that had to go in to basically connect you to the city? Just what are some of the things that come to mind? Sewer.
Electrical.
Electric. I heard water.
Culinary, stormwater, secondary water.
A few things on that list.
Mm-hmm.
Streets. Parks. Sidewalks. There's a whole host of infrastructure that has to be built to support a new business or a new home. And the question is, who should pay for it? And it has been the policy of the city and the policy of nearly every city in the state for many, many years that new growth should pay its own way. That if a development's going to come in, they should be responsible to pay for the costs of all of the infrastructure that they are creating the need for, as opposed to the existing taxpayers through higher taxes paying for that infrastructure. In large part because you already all paid for it. We already all paid for it when we bought our homes in the first place. There's basically three ways that developers provide this infrastructure. The first is through what you call an exaction, where you require them to put it in themselves. New subdivision goes in, we have a requirement through our land use process that says you have to build the street, you have to put in the water lines, you have to do everything necessary for that. Over the years, that got a lot of pushback from the development community because let's take, for example, a utility such as water. So to get a new subdivision is built, let's say it's 600 homes, and it requires a new water tank. Or even better yet, let's say it's a subdivision of 50 homes, but it's the tipping point. It's the point at which our system can no longer provide enough water, so a new water tank has to be developed. So we would tell a developer, well, you're causing the need for this water tank, you have to provide it. The development community, of course, say, well, that's not fair. We're only 50 units out of all that would be required in this water tank. We shouldn't have to bear the full cost, even though they're the tipping point. So a very interesting, a very fair way of distributing this cost was implemented called impact fees. Impact fees are a way that cities can have developers pay for their proportionate share of infrastructure, as opposed to having to pay for all of it at the time of development. And it seemed like a good deal at first, but as you know, and I'm preaching to the choir, over time, the development community has said over and over, well, those are too expensive. We shouldn't why are we paying development fees for water? Why are we paid, cities charge too much for impact fees. So the first method for those following along at home, the first method of getting this infrastructure is the developer builds it all. The second can be impact fees, and Bountiful does both. We have water impact fees, but there are other things we just require them to build or to pay us when we build, such as our water lines. And the third one is what you would call a contribution or a donation. But nearly every contribution or donation from a developer is done in exchange for a benefit to them, such as a little bit higher density, or, there's a variety of things in city codes. They might donate a parcel of land that they don't want to maintain and say, here's a pocket park. We'll put grass on it, and we'll put a playground on it, and we'll donate it to the city. Of course, the problem with all of this infrastructure is not only does it have to be paid for up front, it has to be maintained in perpetuity. And so this underlying question related to affordable housing is who should pay for this cost of this cost of infrastructure? The development community wants to say that impact fees and exactions and things like that, and building standards such as requiring a park strip or things like that, are making housing unaffordable and therefore should go away or be heavily regulated. All that's going to do is push the burden onto existing taxpayers. Now, maybe that's a legitimate policy decision. Maybe in the interest of providing new homes and things, that's something that ought to be considered. But the problem that I see is it's not even being discussed at the legislature. They're getting to the end without discussing these underlying principles. So I believe this is one issue that we need to speak with our legislators about. Any insight on this issue? Any thoughts that you have, council, before I move to the next one?
I think one of the things that I find interesting is there's a one-time cost to the infrastructure, then there's the ongoing cost that you have mentioned. And the ongoing cost is always borne by the taxpayers of the city. And the question is just that upfront cost. And therefore it makes that even more of an important policy discussion, because there's always been the understanding that at some point down the road, when the road or the sewer line or whatever needs to be replaced, it becomes a city expense. And so It's only this small window that, where the developer is potentially part of that solution.
Gary, too, if I read correctly, the materials you passed out, is that they're worried about the fact that is 61% of these costs, these fees and so forth, they've been worried about that, but really since 2008, was it 2008, that we've only gone up 1%
So
in cost of fees?
yeah, you're stealing my thunder.
I'm sorry.
You bet.
Gosh,
This is
I'm sorry.
perfect.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
So I just want to say, if you're done, Mayor, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm done.
The sad truth is that the legislature can always point to one bad actor or two bad actors to justify the silliness that they're proposing. I mean, there are some cities who have confiscatory impact fees. There are cities that don't allow any multifamily in their zones. There are cities that are unreasonable in trying to help deal with the problem, but not very many of them. And the legislature is trying to fix one or two or three cities by completely revamping the system, taking our authority away, frankly, taking the voice of our residents away in this conversation, and trying to paint it with a brush that's just too broad to be workable.
Oh, that's another one that's being proposed by the development community, is that decisions that used to be made by the city council, such as rezones or similar, would now all be administrative decisions. And so that, one, their thinking in the back of their mind is because they wouldn't be referable. But two, it's to make, and their argument is it would be much quicker if, staff could just stamp something. But what it also does is it completely takes away the voice of the community and the potential public concerns that might be presented by this development or that development. So issue two that I think we need to have a conversation with our legislators about, and that we need to demystify, is really how much are the cost of municipal fees in the cost of a house. That is a song that has been sung for many years and is getting a lot of play at the legislature right now, that it is our costs that are making housing unaffordable. In 2018, Ken Ivory from Ivory Homes did a presentation for the Salt Lake Chamber, who was very interested in housing affordability politically and very involved. And he shared a very similar presentation the next week with the City Managers Association. This is the slide deck I'll show you what he showed us and the slide that he omitted that he shared with the chamber. So he used this comparison of how much the cost to build a home has gone up from 2008 to 2018. And he said, it's increased basically a third, $103,000 in that period of time. And he showed without any percentages what the breakout of that was. The next slide that he showed to the city managers was this slide, which is what is impacting the cost the most. And if you look at that, moving from the left, 43% of the cost is the change. Now, this is not the cost, but this is the change. That land cost had increased 43%, and all municipal fees had gone up 61% over 10 years, and that lot improvements had gone up 62% in that period of time. His implication was that look how much city fees have gone up in 10 years. The slide he did not show us, but he did show the chamber, and that's the copy I have, was this slide, which is actually how much of a percentage of the cost to build a home are municipal fees. And remember, these are fees that are paying for sidewalks, storm drain, water, power, the cost for inspections, et cetera, et cetera. 6.2% in 2018 is the cost to build a home. In 2008, it was 5.2. So in that period of time, it's only gone up 1% of the cost of housing. So I appreciate Ivory Homes providing this data for us. They're not sharing it now, but I think we ought to demystify that, that the cost that is being required by municipal governments, one, is necessary, and two, is not exorbitant. Issue 3 that's not being discussed but should be, which is, as we're talking about all of these policies to make housing more affordable, which ones are going to translate to actual lower costs for the home buyer? The worst possible scenario for local governments and our residents would be that there is sweeping legislation at the state that takes away our ability to make decisions, to get input from our residents on those decisions, and then at the end of the day only results in higher revenues for developers and not lower costs for the home buyer. So let me give you an example. Let's assume we have a zone where in a particular neighborhood, a person can build 4 apartment complex, and they all have to be on one level, and you can put 4 units per acre. Okay, so they have 4 units on 1 acre, but you can't go up 2 stories. So, and there's going to be a price for that. Well, let's assume they come back and they ask for us to double that and allow a second story. What is the likelihood that they're going to sell those units for less than they would have, 8 units for less per unit than they would have 4 units per or 4 per unit? I mean, the likelihood that the market is going to dictate how much they can purchase. And in many meetings with the Property Rights Coalition, the question has been asked by some of us city representatives, and Clint's not here, but he could attest to this because he's been in those meetings. If the cities lower their fees, will you lower your profits? And the answer is always, well, we're not required to do that. We have to make a profit. You can't tell us that we can't make, that's un-American, right? And so I believe there is legitimate concern that in our haste to adopt policies that are going to result in lower costs, it's just going to end up, it will not benefit the home buyer. And then the last issue I think we need to have some conversations with our local legislators is this one, is, why is local decision-making important, and what's at stake if it's taken away? We hear a lot in our conversations at the legislature, the comment that, well, I believe in local government, or I believe that the government that's closest to the people is the best government. But it's always followed by but. And that but is, but this particular issue is so important that we can't afford to let cities make the decision. That was the argument for the, well, I was going to say that's the argument for a lot of things. That was the particular argument for the what's the big inland port. Mm-hmm. This is much too important for a city to be able to decide what happens here. Salt Lake City is not capable of making a decision and using this land, although it is Salt Lake City that operates an international airport and seems to do pretty well. But that was the argument. This is much too big of a decision for a city to be able to make. Or the statewide interest is too great to let cities have this. Or it's too hard of a decision for local government. We need to provide political cover for our local elected officials, which is code for we know your residents are going to get mad and that you'll listen to them. We don't want you to listen to them. These are the kinds of arguments that we're hearing and that I'm afraid are not being heard. And, 15 years ago, 40% of the legislators were former local government officials. That's down to about 10%. And so many of our legislators, really not through a lot of fault of their own, they don't have the perspective of why local government works. They don't understand why a resident with an issue, as was pointed out in our conversations with Ray Ward last year by Kate and Millie, basically has 24/7 access to a lawmaker. And we have meetings every other week where we can affect change. Whereas if that law is held at the state level, it's once a year for 45 days, and you've got to convince, what's the number of legislators in the House and Senate?
75 and 29.
Yeah. You got to get 38, 15, and 1 to support it, in addition to all the other things that they're worried about. I don't think the members of our legislature understand why local control is important, and I think it's incumbent upon us to help them understand that. And I'm afraid that if we don't begin doing that now, these conversations are happening. I mean, they've been happening for a couple of months now. That by the time the legislative session rolls around, it'll be too late. We need to help our legislators trust you as local elected officials and be more worried about your opinions than the opinions of leadership in the House and Senate. And to have as much respect for your local decision-making as they do for their own. Too often, I have found that more and more that there is a feeling of cities are the creature of the state, and as a legislature, we have a responsibility to tell you what to do. They don't recognize you as partners in helping Utah be the great place it is. So to me, I wanted to point out 4 of the big issues that I feel like are not being discussed in this debate that really need to be. And we probably need to have those conversations sooner rather than later. My closing thought was this. Winston Churchill said, and Rahm Emanuel said it more recently, but never let a good crisis go to waste. My fear is that the affordable housing crisis and the rising housing cost crisis is just the opportunity that some parties with a profit motive have been waiting for to affect legislation that will permanently damage our ability as local governments to do the things that our residents want. So with that, happy to answer questions about any specifics. I purposely didn't want to get into the specific proposals other than what I've said tonight until I talked about the background stuff, but turn the time back to you, Council, for discussion and next steps and what you'd like to do, and thank you.
What do you recommend, Gary? I mean, do you think that we should have a meeting with our legislators soon and just invite them and talk to them, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think, elected officials listen to elected officials. And even though staff, we represent you, and hopefully represent you accurately and articulately, there's just nothing quite like having an elected official talk to an elected official. And I think there might be a couple of steps. I think we probably ought to have an informal conversation where we can, a subset of you can probably spend some time and talk in some detail about our concerns, and begin educating them and hearing their opinions about what they see, but also us sharing our opinions about what we see, and providing a counter argument to the things that they're hearing from the development community about cities. I think we need to do that soon, and I think some regular meetings between now and the legislative session would be important. And if I can be so bold, I think we need to hold them accountable. This council did a wonderful job last year with Representative Ward in inviting him to come and being very bold and direct, but kind in sharing how you felt he was disrespectful of the local decision-making that you'd taken over a year to make on accessory dwelling units. And it made a difference for the rest of the session, for sure. And to raise credit, he listened to that and he took that to heart. But I think we need to hold our elected officials accountable at the state level.
Could we, excuse me.
Don't get Millie.
Could we do something similar, a work session like this, and repeating everything that you just did and inviting our 3 representatives here and do a work session so we could they could see what it is we're talking about?
I think my suggestion might be to do this was pretty,
smaller?
a little smaller to begin with. And then once they have the same information that you have, that we can come together and have a little bit broader conversation about maybe some specifics and your expectations. But I'd like to take some time, maybe with the mayor and Kate, because they're both on the Legislative Policy Committee, and sit down with them and and go through some of this in some detail. We have some other information to share as well that would be good.
Oh, Gary, another point might be that, and I think you've done this before, but this is so important that we're on the same page, and they're very organized on that other side. And having the correct talking points so that we stay on task, providing some of that basic information to all of us, I think would really be important. I suspect you're planning on doing that.
Be happy to do that, sure.
Thank you.
A question for Gary. Has the other city managers in our North Davis area had the opportunity to meet and go through this together and be able to present that to their council?
So we meet informally every month or so, and this was a big topic of conversation 2 months ago. Part of it is, how do you have the conversation? What do we talk about? Not everybody has the luxury that we do in Bountiful to have the mayor being so involved with the Legislative Affairs Committee at the Chamber and me at the League and Kate at the League and on the Hill. And so they don't have quite the depth of understanding that we might have as a city. And so part of it was giving them some of this information, and they all have a lot of desire to have these conversations. But I think a lot of it, as I said, really needs to come from the elected officials because, you're the peers. And I think the city managers are trying to get information to share with their councils and then let their councils decide what to do with it. I have a very clear understanding where you all stand on many of these things. Every city is going to have a little bit different take. And it's up to the, councils to make those policy decisions and how they want to work. But long story, sorry, that was a long answer. The city managers are getting up to speed, and we are trying, in conjunction with the League of Cities and Towns, to provide you all with good information, and to hopefully all of the cities will begin developing these relationships with our legislators.
If I could share a couple thoughts. I think Gary's idea about a smaller group meeting is definitely a good one and one we should consider. I think what's probably necessary, because none of our 3 legislators have ever served on a city council, haven't served.
Todd did.
I take that, you're right, I take that back. Senator Weiler did serve, but our 2 state house members haven't served. I think they need to be able to spend a bunch of time in a back and forth type of environment where they can ask questions about how planning commissions work, where we can show them real life examples, potentially even drive them to real life examples within our city and show them developments and issues that we've had to work through, ways in which we've been accommodating, ways in which we've had to hold certain lines and why those lines have been important. And so I think that type of flexibility is better in that small group setting than potentially where we can't leave this room and go see those examples. The other thing I think is important is, we have, in part because of Gary's role on the board for the League of Cities and Towns, an interesting and unique perspective into what those legislative actions look like. I get to, walk into worlds that give me some of that unique perspective, but our sister cities don't necessarily have that perspective. And so I think when we're in meetings with them on different boards and things we serve, that it's important we help them understand the importance of these issues, so that they are prepared to shoulder some of that burden. And I think it's also important, as Richard pointed out, there are some cities that make this problem possible and some cities that are doing great things. And so when we become aware of those things, we need to help our fellow sister cities work to solve those problems so they can't be used as a one-size-fits-all example of why this authority should be removed from us.
Kate, the county commission is really in the same boat. Bob Stevenson, of course, has been the mayor, and he's the only one that's had city responsibilities. And that's exactly what he's done. He's taken them out and shown them certain things, trying to educate them. But still, it's really hard if you haven't done it. You just haven't done it, So it's a little bit of uphill battle to kind of understand where you're from, So these small groups would be great.
Any other comments or thoughts or direction, council? And I hope you don't mind my candor. I tried to not also be overly emotional, but this really frustrates me, as you can tell.
We need this.
Would it be useful for us to write up and pass some sort of a resolution and provide a framework for other cities to do the same? Or do we want to stay out of that arena?
I think it's something we could consider. I think sharing stories of with your peers is really important. Our legislature, I think we need to be honest, it's an anecdote-driven legislative body. How many bills were considered last year, Kate? In 45 days?
Over 1,000, only about 500 plus or minus, pass each year, so.
In 45 days, they don't have the time to be data-driven. They're very anecdote-driven. And the problem that Richard pointed out is that there's always going to be a bad story or a bad actor. The difficulty with that is it gets used as the example. And it takes 20 good examples to overcome the example, one bad example. We all know that. And so the degree to which we can share with the stories with one another about the good things that are happening, the efforts that we are making, the rezoning that we have done to allow more density in town, how we're trying to put that around our corridors to encourage your peers if you hear something, and we try to do this as city managers, if they're doing something that's, making roadblocks that are unnecessary for the development community, well, let's get it figured out and straighten it out. And as much as anything, to stay plugged in with the League of Cities and Towns and participate in that process. Just some thoughts.
The other thing we might want to consider, last year was the first legislative session where we published to the residents and to our legislators a tracking list with bill positions. I would strongly suggest we do the same. We do it earlier, that we invite our legislators to meet with us earlier in the fall, before everyone gets worried about the busyness of the holiday season, and that perhaps we even find more times during the legislature, whether it's early in the morning or late in the evening or on a weekend, where we engage with them, perhaps in a regional effort, because they, several of them cover multiple cities, to talk about some of these issues, because I think the legislative session is such a crunch time that if we aren't using all of our avenues to reach out to them, then we'll be behind that effort from those who are constantly up at the Capitol.
We'll plan on that and spread the word with them and make that happen. Maybe just a couple of closing thoughts for me on this topic, if I can, Mayor. One is that I would hate to give the impression that somehow in speaking here, that I'm speaking on behalf of Bountiful, that development is bad, or that developers are bad, or home builders are bad. That's not the case, and it's not what I'm certainly trying to represent. A property owner has a right to develop their property just as much as a resident has a right to live on their property. But a development interest is typically short-term. It's to build a home, make a profit, subdivide grandma's lot that the family's had for years and years, and put a few homes and use that for retirement. I mean, that's all legitimate and worthwhile, and I know that you all respect the right of property owners to do what they will with their property. But there's another property right too, and that's the property right of the existing neighbor who has expectations about the area that they moved into. If you move into a single-family residential neighborhood, you expect it to stay typically a single-family residential neighborhood, or have some say in the local process to change it. The role of local government in particular is to be the balance between those two interests, the long-term interest of the neighbor and the short-term interest of the development. If you handicap the local government's ability to do that, you are putting your hand on the scale on one side or the other. And I think that's the message that we need to share, is that you play a vital role in balancing those interests.
So, Mayor,
Yes.
Are we going to set a time then to meet as a council with our legislators on just a private meeting and discuss this?
I think Gary is talking about doing a small group meeting and maybe setting some possible dates or kind of timeframes. Because what we're going to do sooner than later are these small groups. And then I think and in the fall, making sure that we're heading off at the pass.
So we are setting dates.
Yeah.
And I think, am I right, Gary, you're going to propose these dates to us based on the discussion we've had today?
Yeah, we'll reach
And-
out right now right away to to
Yeah.
our
And
legislators.
so they get those organized for us, and then we'll move forward. Does that sound okay? Okay. Good, thanks, Gary. This is, all of you who are here to watch this is really, really an important issue for all of you. This is really important to us in our future. So thanks for being here.
Okay,
Gary, anything else?
not
You
on
ready
that
to go to?
topic. Should we talk about something funner and happier?
Yeah, let's do funner. Yeah,
Okay.
we like that.
All right, this one shouldn't be as much of a long conversation.
No.
The 9/11 Foundation is promoting a nationwide day of service to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And they have reached out across the country to try and encourage people on 9/11, which is a Saturday, or the days around that, to get out and do something good and to serve. And so we've been contacted by some of the local churches. Many others have reached out, and some folks are very interested in providing manpower and resources to do something on 9/11 or thereabouts. You may all recall that 2 years ago, we tried to start a tradition of a day of service that I think was very successful in the spring, and then, of course, COVID, disrupted our plans for a sequel last year. But it seems to me that this national movement, would fit very well with our desires as a city to have a pretty robust day of service. So, first question is if the council's interested in having staff work with maybe our emergency districts and the local churches of all denominations and organizations to organize a day of service. It would take a significant number of staff hours, but it's something that you wanted to do anyway. And I think we have a unique opportunity this year with the 9/11 Foundation to do something pretty meaningful.
I think we definitely should do something, so we can talk about what, but does that mean that, since it's a Saturday, would that be tricky with using staff, and would that mean things like overtime, and how does that?
Well, the last one we did is on a Saturday too, and this is something we can figure out, right? It's not every day that you get the opportunity, from what has been told to us, to have upwards of 10,000 volunteers in your community. If the local stakes and wards are mobilizing like they tell us they are willing to mobilize, and we could have a huge number of people available to do service. One of the needs that was mentioned to us was there's a great desire, as a result of the fire last year and the drought this year and the many other things, to do quite a bit of wood debris cleanup on the eastern bench. So we met with some of the folks that are interested in this in the fire district, and one of the major things that we would do is we would work with the local emergency districts to identify properties that want to have cleanup done, give the local districts an idea of how many people you could really use per property, and then work through the district's wards and stakes to organize the people. First, a group to come down and get trained in the weeks in advance on how to appropriately, create defensible space, which isn't just clear cutting your property. Those would then become the supervisors for the volunteers that would show up. And they would provide not only the manpower to cut and trim, but also to haul and transport the stuff to the landfill. because we know we can't do it. We know from the windstorm how long it would take if they just put piles, for us to clear the piles out. So that's one major effort that everybody that has talked with us so far is very interested in doing. We know we have a variety of other things in our parks that we could also get people to do, some of it fire-related, particularly in Creekside Park. Anyway, we're just beginning to develop the ideas, but we think it doesn't all need to be done on that day. But another suggestion that was made, that we also maybe provide a place at the town square or on or at the Tabernacle where throughout the day people can stop in and get water bottles and see one another or get a popsicle or something, which sounds a little bit like what we were trying to do, the discussion around the 24th. But a big advantage of these service events is for people to see each other and to meet. And so the second question is, if you're interested in the city playing a leading role in organizing this, is if you'd be comfortable having the town square be available for, as a gathering location and a few things like that, for some water or whatever. So with that, council, what are your thoughts and direction and ideas?
I think it sounds great. I think we should do it and be thoughtful about the projects and how we can spread the volunteers out across the city. And I think using the town square sounds great, and I'm happy to help be one of the volunteers in some region that day.
Hear, hear.
I totally agree. I love service, and I love for the opportunity for residents to give back. I've had over 150 that have volunteered right now to come to the Veterans Park to clean. I said, the park is kept perfectly. We don't need to come. But I've had that many ask if they could come on 9/11 and help something in the Veterans Park. So I think there's an opportunity here that we need to take advantage of. I do.
And I think since there's already the groundswell of volunteers, of people who are willing to participate that day, I think it would be a missed opportunity very much on the city's part, so I'm in full support.
Yeah. Honestly, I think our challenge is going to be supervision. I mean, to do something efficiently, you really can't have more than 20 volunteers, one person managing 20 volunteers, and so that's going to be a big piece of this is,
Anything from you, Kendall?
So we'll be open to ideas about things that we can propose that residents could help with. So we should be thinking about those things, right?
Yes. Yeah, we have a meeting
That's great.
scheduled tomorrow. Some of our staff, like Charles and Lloyd and Chief Beeler and Brock, to meet with a couple of the representatives from the stakes, and I think we might have some emergency district folks to begin to hear what they met last week in anticipation of this meeting. I told them I was going to come and get direction from you all. So we're going to start generating ideas tomorrow in addition to the fire, and then I'll just report back. But as you have ideas, by all means, email them maybe to Shauna, and she could be the clearinghouse for the ideas.
I think Richard has a comment or two, please.
Yeah,
Richard.
I wonder if it would be worthwhile to put it back to the religious organizations to find projects as well. I know that municipal projects can be large and can accommodate a lot of people, but there may be opportunities for us to help specific folks in neighborhoods that we don't know about, but that they would. I don't know if if that would be unmanageable, but it might at least be worth discussing.
I've talked a little bit with Gary about this very thing. Maybe about a month ago, the Episcopal Church down there on Second West, down from you, Ron Burt and that church coalition, I can't remember the exact name of it, but they did all the cleanup from the windstorms in the back of that church, and they had it all beautifully organized. And so I really agree. I was telling Gary that the first time that we had the tour of Utah, that bike race here, we were supposed to have 300 volunteers, and we had about 250 or 275 signed up the night before, and the next morning, 300 people who had not signed up from Bountiful showed up to be volunteers. And it just kind of shows you what Bountiful is made of. So you know, this can happen, it can happen, really be positive.
I think we're very likely to have more volunteers than we could possibly handle on just this city projects. And
Well, we can hope so.
so if we do this right, we can identify how many volunteers we need for the city projects and then say, all right, you know, go find people in your neighborhood and let's identify those in advance as well. I think that's doable.
Okay, any other things? If there are no other comments, we'll take a little break right now, and then we'll convene in 10 minutes. It's a little longer than we usually have.